Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope everyone is doing well, and welcome to all the new subscribers. The channel's gotten some new subscribers, it's growing, so that's wonderful news. So, welcome everyone who's new. Okay, so we're on to the next chapter, which is Bill Clinton. So, this is going to be really, really interesting, I feel like. Pretty interesting chapter, period of time we're moving into. So, let's do this, shall we? The Partnership for Peace. Missed chance. President Bill Clinton, 1993 to 2001, could have called off the new Cold War before things went too far. Instead, he committed the United States to a path of confrontation with Russia, expanding NATO in his second term over strenuous Russian objections. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were officially inducted in 1999. Though the Russians had pulled their military out of Eastern Europe and cut its size by 70% by 1996, the decision was made in June 1993 that NATO expansion would go forward. True partnership with Russia in the CSCE or a similar arrangement was never truly on the table to be canceled. The administration argued that the Russians would not mind. Maybe they would join too, the Democrats said. Drunken blunder. In September 1993, Yeltsin wrote a letter to Clinton after returning home from Poland, where President Lech Walesa may have gotten him stinking drunk before persuading him to agree that Poland could join any alliance they wished. The Pole said it was not the alcohol, but a threat by Walesa to form an explicitly anti-Russian alliance with Ukraine if Yeltsin would not give in on their membership in NATO. Either way, Yeltsin seemed to be trying to mitigate the damage by clarifying the Russian position to the American president. Referring to Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, Yeltsin conceded that they wished to join NATO in part due to the by no means nostalgic sentiments of the East Europeans toward past cooperation within the framework of the Warsaw Pact. He added, overall, the impression is that they do have grounds for a certain amount of apprehension about their security. Still, Yeltsin wrote, I cannot help but express our uneasiness as well over the fact that the discussion of how NATO might evolve is centering with increasing frequency on the scenario of quantitative expansion of the alliance by adding Eastern European countries. He attempted to insist instead on a truly pan-European security system, an approach predicated on collective but not the basis of bloc membership actions to prevent and resolve the crisis and conflicts that now have Europe in turmoil. He said that even though he did not think expansion would automatically lead to the alliance somehow turning against Russia, they had to think carefully about the consequences for domestic politics. Not only the opposition, but moderate circles as well, would no doubt perceive this as a sort of neo-isolation of our country in diametric opposition to its natural admission into Euro-Atlantic space. And he reminded Clinton of the Bush administration's promises invoking the spirit of the treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany signed in September 1990. He pointed to its prohibitions against the deployment of foreign troops within former East Germany, concluding this language precludes the option of expanding the NATO zone into the east. He continued, in general, we advocate that relations between our country and NATO be a few degrees warmer than those between the alliance and Eastern Europe, and once again brought up at least the long-term possibility that Russia itself could join the alliance. After Yeltsin's blunder in Poland, Russia's foreign minister, Andrei Koskrev, told U.S. Ambassador Thomas Pickering that Russia was fine with NATO expansion if they could be the first to join. After Yeltsin brought up President H.W. Bush's promises, the State Department went back to see if it was true. Secretary of State Warren Christopher arranged a meeting with German Foreign Minister Klaus Krinkel, who had been Hans Dietrich Genscher's protege and was still in contact with him, along with Dieter Krastrup, Krinkel's top aide. Krinkel and Krastrup told Christopher that though it was not stipulated in the 1990 treaty, the Russians' interpretation had political and psychological substance that we had to take seriously. Khrushchev added that the basic philosophy of the agreement had been that NATO would not expand to the east, and that he could see why Yeltsin thought the West had committed itself not to expand NATO beyond its 1990 limits. So that's really interesting. Fooling Yeltsin. At the end of September 1993, after receiving advanced praise from the administration, Yeltsin attempted to dissolve the Congress of People's Deputies and Parliament. When they refused and instead impeached and replaced him, his forces violently attacked the Russian White House, their parliament building, killing 144 people. He then abolished the body and forced through a new constitution which centralized more power in the presidency. So there was like an old guard, because remember, this is very, very close to communism. So it's a very dangerous time. There are factions that want it to stay communist. They're like hardline factions. There's alt-right factions, and there's all this craziness going on. Not to mention there's craziness that we've been reading about going on their borders, which is causing problems. And there was tons of terrorist attacks in their country at the time. So yeah. Clinton made it clear his administration endorsed Yeltsin's attack, telling him history is on your side. In a speech at the Russian Academy for the National Economy, Secretary Christopher declared that Russia is being reborn as a democracy and called the democratically elected parliament the last grasp of the old order in Russia. Christopher explained, the United States does not easily support the suspension of parliaments, but these are extraordinary times. The steps taken by President Yeltsin were in response to exceptional circumstances. Soon after the attack, Christopher met with Yeltsin and his foreign minister in Moscow. The secretary assured him that the U.S. would not expand the NATO alliance and would instead seek to integrate Russia and the entire former Warsaw Pact into a new organization to be called the Partnership for Peace, PFP. Though in truth, PFP was always meant to serve not as a separate organization, but a pathway to NATO membership. Ambassador at Large and Special Advisor to the Secretary of State on the new independent state, Strobe Talbot, had cautioned in an internal memo that they should emphasize the PFP instead of NATO expansion for the time being. Talbot explained, the key principle as I see it is this. An expanded NATO that excludes Russia will not serve to contain Russia's retrograde expansionist impulses. Quite the contrary, it will further provoke them. In a memo to Clinton, National Security Advisor Anthony Lake summed up consensus of an NSC meeting where they had decided to emphasize the PFP just 3 days before Christopher met with Yeltsin. All your advisors agree that doing anything at this stage to indicate that NATO's border will move closer to Russia and Ukraine without, at the same time, including those two states would have major negative consequences within both. This was why they wanted to push the ruse of the Partnership for Peace, which Lake told Clinton was truly meant to be the first step toward full NATO membership, but Russia would not be allowed in to the alliance. They would instead be led to believe PFP would replace a new, more political NATO. The cable documenting Christopher and Yeltsin's conversation reads, turning to the question of NATO expansion, Secretary Christopher explained the U.S. approach of establishing a partnership for peace and stressed that the approach to future new membership in the alliance was inclusive and non-discriminatory. Yeltsin was enthusiastic. He called it a brilliant proposal, pledged his full support, and thanked President Clinton for his leadership on this issue. Christopher also told Yeltsin that the European allies were already agreed. I'm delighted with your approval, and now I predict widespread acceptance of the idea. They told him the PFP would be open to all members of the former Soviet Union, including Russia and Central Asian Muslim stands. Christopher assured Yeltsin there would be no effort to exclude anyone, and there would be no step taken at this time to push anyone ahead of the others. Yeltsin interrupted to clarify if the secretary meant to say that all former Soviet states would be on equal footing and there would be a partnership, not a membership. Secretary Christopher told him, yes, this is the case. There would not even be an associate status. Yeltsin replied, "This is a brilliant idea. This is a stroke of genius." Yeltsin then said that this serves to dissipate all the tension which we now have in Russia regarding Eastern European states and their aspirations with respect to NATO. It would have been an issue for Russia, particularly if it left us in a second-class status. He added, "Now, under your new idea, we are all equal, and it will ensure equal participation on the basis of partnership. It really is a great idea, really great. Tell Bill I'm thrilled by this brilliant stroke." Christopher said, "We will tell him that you bought his recommendation with real enthusiasm." Yeltsin replied, "Of course, yes, yes." So, if you listen to anything that the officials put out in Russia, like when they're talking diplomatically or giving speeches about other countries, their work with other countries and stuff like that, one of the things that you'll notice they say a lot is our partners. So when they refer to the United States, they'll say our partners, the US, our partners, the whoever XYZ. That's a reminder that from these talks, I believe that's what they're saying when they say that they're all supposed to be partners. Christopher and Talbot both later claimed that Yeltsin had misunderstood them, but as Brookings Institute scholar James Goldgeiger pointed out, the meeting notes showed they had misled him. After getting an excited response from the Russian president over the Partnership for Peace proposal, Christopher seemed to add as an afterthought that they would be looking at the question of membership as a longer-term eventuality. It does not appear that Yeltsin heard or understood this, though Talbot blames him, saying he had drunkenly interrupted Christopher in his excitement and did not hear the bad news before shooing the two Americans out the door. It is also a fact that earlier that very same day, Christopher told Foreign Minister Khrushchev that the PFP would be open to all, rendering their denials implausible. According to the State Department notes of the meeting, Christopher mentioned the possibility of NATO expansion in the long-term future, but said that no one would be excluded and instead stressed that the Partnership for Peace would be open to all, the NACC, North Atlantic Cooperation Council countries. When Kozyrev asked if there would be new NATO members now, the secretary said no, they were emphasizing a partnership for peace instead. This was a successful lie. As of late 1994, Khrushchev was confused about what was happening and was still boasting that he had helped to prevent NATO's expansion eastward to our borders. Even the Poles were deceived and thought they were being betrayed by the United States, which seemed to be favoring the PFP, which lacked a true security guarantee over the NATO alliance. Betrayal. Goldgeiger, who believed Bush Sr. and Baker's promises against expansion in 1990 had been overblown, said this betrayal of an explicit vow in October 1993 by Clinton Secretary of State to pursue the Partnership for Peace instead of NATO expansion guaranteeing full Russian participation in the future security of Europe was much worse. Unlike the 1990 meeting, Goldgeiger wrote, which was focused on the status of Germany in NATO. This meeting was specifically about NATO's future relationship with Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. He added that Yeltsin thought he had dodged the NATO enlargement bullet at the time at which he was in a raging political battle against hardliners at home. Okay, so let's talk about hardliners. So oftentimes in geopolitics, you'll hear people talk about hardliners. So oftentimes the person that is in power, elected by the people or just by chance happens to be there, and they have, in that case of the latter, they will have become more moderate over time as they're in power longer, because often they will chill out over time. Leaders in other countries tend to be there a lot longer than ours in the United States. And so over time, they will sort of chill out and be a much more moderate. And then leaders who are elected also tend to be more moderate because the people tend to want to elect more moderate people. For example, in the United States, you see this reflected as well. So let's take the recent Virginia state Senate governor elections. So the woman that ran for governor there as a Democrat ran as a moderate Democrat. And even though she very much is not, and the consequences of that are playing out, the people tend to want to have more moderate leaders and power. And so often the leader of a country will be much more moderate than the people under them in their cabinet and stuff. And that's referred to hardliners. And then if something happens where a country's leader is taken out, the hardliner, like the next person in, will normally be a hardliner, meaning they're much more aggressive and much more uncooperative and sort of like angry at the way that they perceive that they've been treated and such like that. So when you hear that line in geopolitics, that's what they're talking about. But then in January, and the reason why they were having this issue with hardliners is because the people under them didn't like, they were noticing like, hey, this looks like we're getting ill-treated by the United States, who were like literally our enemies like 5 minutes ago, right? So they're like, what is going on? What are you doing? And so that causes strain and tension on the leader with the people that are under them in the political sphere. But then in January 1994, as they were preparing the official launch of the PFP, Clinton began speaking of it as a track that will lead to NATO membership for Central and Eastern European states. On January 11th, he admitted to Czech President Václav Havel, however, that there is no consensus now among NATO allies to extend formal security guarantees for two reasons. First, it is not clear who would contribute to the common defense, and second, the reaction in Russia would be the reverse of what we want. He went on to describe the PFP as simply the path toward joining the alliance without drawing another line dividing Europe, unless Russia did so first. But the next day, just after the official launch of the Partnership for Peace, Clinton announced in Prague, the question is no longer whether NATO will take on new members, but when and how. Yeltsin was outraged. The PFP had gone from the centerpiece of the new security system to more of a public relations tool, a distraction from the real effort, while at the same time providing a process toward full membership in the Atlantic Alliance for some chosen countries. When Clinton had dinner with Yeltsin in Moscow in January 1984, the Russian said he was shocked by the statement in Prague that it was not whether but when, but insisted if that were the case, Russia has to be the first country to join NATO. Clinton refused to engage on that point. So the reason why they wanted to be the first to join was because they didn't want to be seen as lesser. So they're a huge country. Just think about Russia. And so you have all these other smaller countries that used to be a part of them. And if it looks like they're getting the out treatment, that's going to cause problems for them just in the way that they're viewed by the countries around them. They're going to be viewed as lesser, right? And really, they should be viewed as higher than them because they are the power of that area, and they should be able to have their sphere of influence and trade with these people and or these countries and have economic relations and such in a way where that's how they're viewed. That's how we are viewed here in the United States, especially in our sphere of influence. And so they're wanting the same thing there for them. In July, Clinton again declared in a speech in Warsaw that NATO expansion was not a question of if but when. Yeltsin seemed resigned to expansion by that time, but again insisted that Russia has to be the first to do so. That way, when the rest of Eastern Europe was integrated, Russia would not be the last and potentially left out. He was worried about how China might react. In keeping with tradition, Clinton simply ignored his statement. Vice President Al Gore explained that it served administrative interest to keep the long-term possibility of Russia membership open, if only to give Yeltsin some sort of talking point to cite when he was criticized by domestic opponents for letting a potential enemy encroach on Russia's historical sphere of influence. So that's what I was just explaining a minute ago. In late 1993, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service under Director Yevgeny Primakov warned that the admission of foreign Warsaw Pact states will be taken by a considerable part of Russian society as the approach of danger to the motherland's borders. The service continued, this expansion would bring the biggest military grouping in the world with its colossal offensive potential directly to the borders of Russia. They judged that they would have to react. If this happens, the need would arise for a fundamental reprisal of all defense concepts on our side, a redeployment of armed forces, and changes in operational plans. Defense Minister Pavel Grekov warned that it would be unfortunate if the former Warsaw Pact states join NATO in the near future because this step would relegate Russia to a much more isolated position. The New York Times said that the administration, eager not to offend the Russians, publicly promoted the PFP rather than the NATO expansion because Washington and NATO officials do not want to increase the influence of ultranationalists in Russia, and certainly not before scheduled parliamentary elections here on December 12th. Ambassador Pickering wrote a cable to Washington that in Russia, there was strong domestic opposition across the political spectrum to early NATO expansion. Yeltsin and Khrushchev were being criticized from their right as too compliant to the West. Nicholas Burns, senior Russian director of the NSC, told Talbot that we need to separate our understandable anger on the tone of the debate from Russia's substantive concerns, which we must take seriously. Pentagon for Peace. Some of the administration, led by Secretary of Defense William Perry, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff John Shelikoshvili, and then Director of Strategic Plans and Policy on the Joint Staff General Wellesley Clark, truly prioritized integrating Russia through the Parliament for peace. But in the hands of the hawks, the PFP turned out to be not much more than a scam. When the new Polish ambassador to the U.S. complained about the process, Talbot explained that the whole point was to fool the Russians into accepting NATO expansion the same way their predecessors had done with their later revised promises about not moving NATO into Eastern Germany after reunification. The Soviets initially refused to accept the former East Germany would be part of the alliance, but over time and with effective reassurances, we were able to bring themselves to agree. They would now repeat the process with the entire former Warsaw Pact. Lake was clear about his purpose as well, telling Christopher that NATO expansion will, when it occurs, by definition be punishment or neo-containment of the bad bear. In a memo to the Principals Committee, Lake wrote that the neo-containment of Russia will be kept in the background only, rarely articulated. On the contrary, the possibility of membership in the long term for a democratic Russia should not be ruled out explicitly. But in the same memo, Lake made clear that was a lie. They would leave open the possibility of NATO membership even for Ukraine and the Baltics, but pursue a parallel track for an alliance for Russia so they could consult without giving them a veto over NATO decisions. In September 1994, Assistant Secretary of State Richard Holbrooke summoned senior defense officials to his office and shouted them down. The PFP would not get in the way of NATO expansion. The president has made the decision, and you're being insubordinate. Holbrooke reportedly yelled at them. The diplomats had out-hawked the warriors. Kissinger-Brzezinski weigh in. Presidents Richard Nixon and General Ford's National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger criticized Clinton's pretended hesitation to expand NATO right away, since it could create a self-fulfilling prophecy of future confrontation. He said this was essentially anti-American defeatism, even though 3 days after that statement, the president had already overridden it, announcing his new NATO agenda. Kissinger cited Secretary of State Dean Acheson from the era of NATO's foundation. Any nation that claims this treaty is directed against it should be reminded of the biblical admonition that the guilty flee where no man pursueth. If the Russians have a problem, then they are just paranoid, and that is simply their problem, not ours. The countries of Eastern Europe are terrified, not threatening. Okay, sure. Kissinger wrote, and besides, the U.S. can give Russian assurances that no foreign troops would be stationed on the soil of new NATO members. He concluded, either the NATO guarantee will be extended or NATO will fall apart. In the pages of Foreign Affairs, influential Carter administration National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, born to a family of Polish aristocrats, agreed, ridiculing the PFP's inclusion of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan as such overreach as to make the organization meaningless. If all are eligible, then as a practical matter, he wrote, none are admissible. He demanded that Clinton proceed with NATO expansion at the PFP's expense. Brzezinski made it clear that despite the high-minded claims of the promoters of NATO expansion, old power politics were still at the forefront of Allies' thinking. Europe is America's essential geopolitical bridgehead on the Eurasian continent, which entrenches American political influence and military power directly on the Eurasian mainland. Meanwhile, Britain, he said, favored expansion to dilute European unity. France was hesitant to enhance German power over Central and Eastern Europe, while the Germans were happy to take up their new role as American subcontractor in the plan to dominate Central and Eastern Europe. When I read that, it reminds me of the farewell address by George Washington. I really love George Washington. But he gave a farewell address, and in that address, he talks about not getting entangled in the foreign affairs of Europe, which are constantly fighting with each other and causing all kinds of problems among themselves, and that we really don't need to concern ourselves with them because of our geographical location. I told you to forget it. Hawks in the administration, led by Lake and Holbrook, as well as NSC Director for Europe Alexander Verschbau and his colleagues Nicholas Burns and Daniel Fried, were eager to begin so-called enlargement. Russia was never going to be allowed to join, they argued, so cut the pretense and start expanding the alliance immediately. When Russian Foreign Minister Khrushchev proposed a European security plan that envisioned both NATO and the CIS as subordinate to an empowered OSEC, the newly renamed CSCE changed from Conference to Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Talbot ridiculed the idea in a memo to Lake. The result would be cumbersome in the extreme and probably self-paralyzing. Though this would give the Russians the mantle of legitimacy under Western supervision, he said it would also severely hamstring NATO's ability to act, which was intolerable. Besides, the Russians' problem is merely that it sticks in their craw that NATO appears poised to dictate the terms of the new order, and Russia has no choice but to accept it. Ukraine's status was always central to the facade of the PFP, with a massive ethnic Russian population and a history tightly bound to that of their larger neighbor. The nation remained a central interest of the Russian Federation. If Kiev could be included in the new security architecture for Europe, along with the United States and the rest of our allies, as well as Russia and the rest of theirs, then that would essentially guarantee Ukrainian neutrality. But with the PFP reduced to a ceremonial role, the real questions were already being raised about Ukraine's future status and the potential for violent conflict over it. When Talbot asked Holbrooke to create a new interagency panel to play up the positive note about NATO expansion, and latter conceded that Ukraine is the most delicate issue and that at best the country would have to settle for the neutral buffer status of Finland in the First Cold War. Secretary Christopher thought they should slow down expansion because it was hard to see how Ukraine can accept being the buffer between NATO, Europe, and Russia. But they proceeded with the policy and deception. On July 5th, 1984, Clinton told Yeltsin, "I would like us to focus on the Partnership for Peace program rather than NATO." According to Talbot, Clinton told Yeltsin at dinner on September 27th, "I've never said we shouldn't consider Russia for membership or special relationship with NATO. So when we talk about NATO expanding, we are emphasizing inclusion, not exclusion. All the American president wanted," he said, "was to work with you and others to maximize the chances of a truly united, undivided, integrated Europe. Yes, NATO would expand, but it would still take several years." And he promised, "I want to work closely with you so we get through it together." He reassured Yeltsin that NATO's expansion is not anti-Russian. It's not intended to be exclusive of Russia, and there's no imminent timetable. We will work together. Ever the salesman, Clinton said, "I don't want you to believe I wake up every morning thinking only about how to make the Warsaw Pact states part of NATO. That's not the way I look at it. What I do think about is how to use NATO expansion to advance the higher goal of European security, unity, and integration, a goal I know you share." I think it's more like they just wanted military bases all over the world. I feel like that's more what it was about. As Talbot explained, this entire line had been carefully designed to deceive. The main points that NATO would expand and Russia would have to accept it had been practiced with the team, but the tone and content were part of an approach that Clinton had worked out in his head during the lunch. Every time he'd said that expansion was going forward, he'd add that it was part of a larger process including Russia. When Yeltsin brought up the question of Russia joining the alliance, Clinton lied again. That U.S. policy would be guided by three no's: no surprises, no rush, and no exclusion. The president broke all three promises at once. Immediately on December 1st, the North Atlantic Council issued a statement announcing that they would expect and welcome NATO enlargement that would reach to democratic states to our east. Though it had the requisite double talk about a united Europe, Yeltsin wasn't buying it anymore. The Baltic nations also recognized the official policy change in the communique and worried if the game was NATO instead of PFP, they would be left out of the first round, which turned out to be true. Budapest blow-up. 3 days later, on December 4th, 1994, at a conference in Budapest, which was supposedly meant to mark the OSCE as a newly improved, more powerful player, Clinton announced NATO remains the bedrock of European security. He added, "Last week we took further steps to prepare for expansion by starting work on the requirements for membership. No country outside will be allowed to veto expansion." It was at the same meeting that the major powers and Ukraine agreed on the so-called Budapest Memorandum, wherein Kyiv said it would return former Soviet nuclear missiles to Russia in exchange for certain security guarantees, which had been a high priority of both the Clinton and Yeltsin administrations. Yeltsin confronted Clinton and the Allies. NATO was created in Cold War times. Today it is trying to find its place in Europe, not without difficulty. It is important that this search not create new divisions, but promote European unity. He complained, "We believe that the plans of expanding NATO are contrary to this logic. Why sow seeds of distrust? After all, we are no longer adversaries, we are partners." He warned that Europe is in danger of plunging into a cold peace. He lamented the true purpose of the expansion. Written between the lines, it was just in case there are undesirable developments in Russia. If the object is to bring NATO up to Russia's borders, let me say one thing. It is too early to bury a democratic Russia. Evidently, he felt especially betrayed because he misunderstood Clinton to mean they would go ahead with the expansion almost immediately in 1995. The Times noted that the next day that even though the administration said no nation would be excluded, both NATO and Moscow know that Russia remains the perceived enemy in Europe and would be at the bottom of the list. Korkov later said that this stunt caused a negative reaction in Moscow, where even the most moderate voices counseling tolerance for gradual expansion had to give it up. Everyone became opposed to all NATO expansion. Clinton understood very well how the Russians felt about it, and the entire population objected. He sent Vice President Gore to Moscow to visit President Yeltsin in his hospital bed, shake hands, and promise that no nations would be added in 1995 in the lead up to Yeltsin's desperate re-election campaign. But as soon as he got home, the principals met in the White House and decided once and for all that Eastern European states' desire to join the alliance far outweighed any Russian concerns. They decided on a 4 to 5 year time frame for the first round of expansion. The State Department sent the U.S. mission to NATO a proposed statement declaring that there would be no second-tier security guarantees. The president then proclaimed the inevitable expansion of NATO in a re-election campaign speech. The illusion of the PFP as a solution to European security was over. Clinton's shame. According to William Burns, then acting deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and later CIA director in the Joe Biden administration, boy, these people just never really go away, do they? Like, all throughout this book, you're like, it's like the same people going all the way back to like Reagan. President Clinton had already ruined the post-Cold War relationship with Russia before the end of 1994. Recalling his memos at the time, Burns wrote in his memoir, "I emphasized mounting Russian concern about expansion of NATO. I noted that Yeltsin's tough public statements in the fall of 1994 about NATO expansion were an unsubtle reminder of Russian angst about neglect of its interests in the process of restructuring European security institutions." He had written in a State Department cable at the time that the honeymoon in American relations with the new Russia that blossomed in the immediate aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union is now long past. They had already abused the friendship to the breaking point. 2 years ago, we could have pretty much had it our way on a whole range of issues so long as we paid some minimal deference to Russian sensibilities. That's no longer the case. Burns also wrote that the staff of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow unanimously opposed NATO expansion. They had proposed other forms of cooperation with the former Warsaw Pact nations and thought it would be wiser to create a new treaty relationship between NATO and Russia. In other words, they were trying to come up with any alternative to avoid the certain consequences of the president's policy. This was because Burns wrote just after Yeltsin's cold peace outrage at Budapest, no fine-tuning of any bureaucratic process for doing so could change the fundamental problem that hostility too early NATO expansion is almost universally felt across the domestic political spectrum here. The Russian elite is very much more focused on outcomes now, since the U.S. refused to listen the process serves mainly to remind Russia of their own weakness. He added that the embassy went out of their way to support including the Russians in the new contact group regarding the war in the Balkans and the G7 group of world economic powers, making it the G8. Not because they had very much power and influence to wield, but they would someday. The idea was that these gestures would help anchor a weak and floundering Russia in the respect and status that came with regular dealings with G7 countries. Regarding NATO expansion, Burns said Yeltsin had considerable justification to believe security Baker's promises still applied after the fall of the USSR. That commitment, however, has never been precisely defined or codified, and the Clinton administration saw its inheritance as fairly ambiguous. Burns pointed to Lake as the leading proponent of expansion in Eastern Europe, who sought to provide these smaller countries with reassurance against the return of aggression from Russia or the newly reunited Germany. The administration knew very well how badly the entire Russian political and military establishments were reacting. An undivided Europe whole and free clearly meant without them. Talbot wrote a lengthy memo to Clinton in April 1995, rehashing the history of their diplomacy on that issue and preparing him for their first meeting after Yeltsin's cold peace statement in Budapest. The mission was to try to get Russia to accept NATO expansion and settle for working with the U.S. under the PFP. Talbot recognized, however, that Yeltsin feared NATO would announce new members during his re-election year in 1996, subjecting him and reformers to withering, perhaps fatal attacks from the communists and nationalists. Talbot, having just returned from Russia, wrote, "Virtually all major players in Russia across the political spectrum are either deeply opposed to or at least deeply worried about NATO expansion." Talbot advised Clinton how to deceive them. Almost as much as it fears NATO expansion, Russia fears its own isolation, he wrote. Moreover, the Russian military very much wants to cooperate as much as possible with NATO. He said that since Russia wants a relationship with NATO, the president could propose an agreement which could, for now at least, be defined in a way that finesses the question of how large a NATO we are talking about. Talbot explained Yeltsin's view, saying, "You can have an undivided Europe or an expanded NATO, but not both. NATO's enlargement is inherently hostile to Russia's interest." He continued, "Speaking from the Russians' point of view, therefore, will cooperate on integration, but resist on NATO enlargement. If you insist on bringing Central European states into NATO, you'll risk redividing Europe into two competing, potentially hostile blocs." Okay, so the reason why the people in Russia and the political class in Russia and the elite people in Russia and just basically Russia was against NATO expansion on their borders can be summed up with what the United States is saying, like especially Marco Rubio, about why they want a confrontation with Iran now. So they want a confrontation with Iran now, they say, so that they do not have to confront in the future an Iran that has the potential to hold things over them and control the Middle East. Okay, so they say that if Iran continues to grow in power, and by power, I don't think they necessarily mean a nuclear weapon, but that's also on the table. But what they actually mean is that Iran is building hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ballistic missiles a month. And the United States, in order to keep Iran under wraps, the United States, the Gulf countries, and Israel would have to have just as many interceptors that Iran has. And that is simply not the case, and they simply cannot make interceptors in the quantities that Iran can make drones and ballistic missiles. So if Iran ends up with a stockpile of way more ballistic missiles than the United States and their allies have of interceptors, then they will be able to have leverage and control the power in the Middle East by means of the Strait of Hormuz and by being able to attack any country that they want without there being a way to subdue them. So therefore they would have diplomatic leverage to basically do whatever they want and get whatever they want. That is the same way that Russia looks at NATO expansion on their borders. If NATO has ballistic missile installments all along their border where ballistic missiles can hit Moscow, then Russia is basically at the mercy of the United States and will no longer have autonomy over its own self. Because if they do anything that the United States does not agree with, or they don't fall in line with the United States, if they don't let the United States basically take everything they want from them, which is what the United States wants to do, then they will have no protection. They will have no leverage. They will have nothing because the United States has already moved in with its military and they've already got them pretty surrounded. So, but Ukraine's a major factor because of the lay of the land, the geography there. So that's where you would do an invading force. So that's why they had to draw the line there. That is what they're talking about when they say they want security guarantees, when they say they don't want missiles on their border, it's because they want to have autonomy as a sovereign state, a really big, powerful sovereign state. Talbot advised Clinton how to deceive them, almost as much as it fears. He continued, speaking from the Russian point of view, therefore will cooperate on integration but resist on NATO enlargement. If you insist on bringing Central European states into NATO, you risk redividing Europe into two competing, potentially hostile blocs. Talbot said the implied warning cold peace could be precluded to a new Cold War. However, he reiterated that there was nothing Yeltsin could do to change their minds. Expansion would proceed with or without further Russian participation in the PFP. So if they want to complain about it, they will succeed only in isolating themselves. Still, Talbot warned that virtually every country in Europe, in and out of NATO, wanted to see the alliance work closely with Russia to avoid provoking spasms of paranoia and countermeasures by Russia. They know from experience that there is nothing more offensive than Russia on the defensive. In May 1995, when Clinton went to Moscow for celebration marking the 50th anniversary of World War II, Yeltsin again stomped his foot through, though he was helpless to do anything to stop the growth of the Western alliance. For me to agree to the borders of NATO expanding towards those of Russia, that would constitute a betrayal on my part of the Russian people. He said, I want to get a clear understanding of your idea of NATO expansion because now I see nothing but humiliation for Russia if you proceed. He asked Clinton, how do you think it looks to us if one bloc continues to exist while Warsaw Pact has been abolished? He said, it's a new form of encirclement if the one surviving Cold War bloc expands right up to the borders of Russia. Many Russians have a sense of fear. What do you want to achieve with this if Russia is your partner? Why do you want to do this? For a man who was said to be a drunk most of the time, Yeltsin certainly appreciated what was at stake. We need a new structure for pan-European security, not old ones, he insisted. We have no blocks, only one European space that provides for its own security. As Talbot suggested, Clinton promised that he would hold off on NATO expansion until after the election of 1996 because he understood how deeply unpopular the policy was among not just the Russian establishment, but the citizens of the country as well. Yeltsin had explicitly asked him for this favor while Clinton commiserated about pressure from the Republican Congress and Midwestern voters pushing the other direction. A month after Clinton's May 1995 visit to Moscow, Burns wrote that nowhere are Russian sensitivities about being excluded or taken advantage of more acute than on the broad issue of European security. This is a solid consensus within the Russian elite that NATO expansion is a bad idea, period. He later wrote, sitting at the embassy in Moscow in the mid-1990s, it seemed to me that NATO expansion was premature at best and needlessly provocative at worst. He said he understood why others would want to reassure Eastern European nations of their safety in the face of a potentially revived Russian power, but argued that they should focus on the partnership for peace. It was wishful thinking, however, to believe that we could open the door to NATO membership without incurring some lasting cost, with a Russian coping with its own historic insecurities. In another cable the embassy sent that fall, they explained why they opposed expanding NATO to include more former Warsaw Pact states after East Germany. They said that in looking to America's own long-term self-interest, it should seek to build a security order in Europe sufficiently in Russia's interests so that a revived Russia will have no compelling reason to revise it. This would ensure that the stab in the back theorists will have only limited room for maneuver in Russian politics. The Russian parliamentarian Alexei Poshkov explained that the assumption that Yeltsin was only opposing their plans for domestic political reasons was completely incorrect. Even Anatoly Chubais, who was very close to the Clinton administration, had publicly said that he agreed with the communists and nationalists on that point. Lake wrote to Clinton in July 1995 that despite Yeltsin's agreement in May to join PFP and launch a beyond PFP process with NATO, opposition to NATO enlargement appears to be hardening across the political spectrum among Russian political elite. He added, key Yeltsin advisors and members of the Duma argue that NATO enlargement and NATO-Russian cooperation are incompatible and are attacking Krykov for acquiescing to the West's agenda. He said that Yeltsin had reportedly approved a plan to delay or derail NATO expansion, including by sowing divisions within the alliance and appealing to opponents in publics and parliaments. Lake continued, opposition to NATO enlargement is unlikely to yield in the near or medium term to some kind of grudging endorsement. Russia's opposition is deep and profound, and concluded, for the period ahead, the Russian leadership will do its level best to derail our policy given its conviction that any eastward expansion of NATO is a route antithetical to Russia's long-term interests. He warned they may be forced to choose between their Central European policy and their strategy regarding Russia, recommending transparency in the process and the parallel track deal as antidotes to the tension being raised. Okay, I think we will leave it there for today. So that was once again Chapter 2, Part 1, Provoked. Let me know what you guys think in the comments about all that. I find it highly disturbing, to be quite honest with you. So we have World War II, all this horrible destruction, everything was really bad. Russia itself lost 27 million people. Then we had the terrible times after that Russia went through with their government, to say the least. Then we had and during that time we also had the Cold War going on, where all kinds of crazy dirty things got put into place. I mean, that is why one of the reasons why our government is so corrupt, because if you're just running around doing dirty things, lying, like I explained in the Spycraft in the ancient times, how it just totally corrupts a country to become so reliant on dirty dealings, which a lot of intelligence is done, and lying and stuff like that, and how it just corrupts a country. You had all that going on. Then, like, by some miraculous event, everything goes swimmingly well when the enemy, the USSR, collapses, and they're like totally willing to work with the United States. They're all about like changing and, becoming democratic and stuff like that. And then you provoke them into feeling very insecure after everything that's happened. You just, like, I mean, what is wrong with these people? This whole thing like, oh, Israel's to blame for everything. No, Clinton was not Jewish, okay? Bush Sr. was not Jewish. Yes, people in their administrations are, of course, like a lot of these names that I'm reading are Jewish, but they're also Americans. And so the ideology, the worldview of these people, as I've explained, which is very, 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 very similar to what we call the neocon worldview. It's well documented. I have talked about it a lot on my shows, especially the earlier ones, the really long ones. I've explained what it is, where it came from, why it's called neocon, means new conservatives. They were left. They came over from the left whenever they got mad at the left because the left moved to the left more in the 60s and didn't support Israel in the 67 war. So the left was becoming more radical and they didn't support Israel's war. So leftists, a lot of them were Trotskyites, so Marxists, became Republicans, switched parties, and not just politicians, but thinkers, writers to New York and stuff. This was movement out of the left into the right. And they immediately got to work with their think tanks and their magazines that they had back then, and where they wrote for the elite class, and that's what the policymakers are reading, et cetera, et cetera. They got to work and they completely shifted the Republican world view. The natural conservative worldview was shifted back in that time. And the people that were on the right their whole lives and have been conservatives their whole lives got labeled names like isolationist. That's where that comes from, was from the neocons. They got called anti-Semites, and they got their lives and their careers destroyed to the point where we don't even know most of their names anymore, even though they were big on the right back then. And the neoconservative worldview didn't just infiltrate only the right, it also infiltrated on the left with Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and people like that. They have a lot of hawkish, neocon-ish worldviews. And it's not like a political ideology, it's a worldview, which I explained the difference of in previous videos. And they then were not super conservative on most things. So that's why over time we have gotten the right has shifted. That's part of the blow up with why Donald Trump got elected and all that stuff, because the right, the Republican class, the establishment right, the GOP, were just slow. It was like, people talk about this, it's like just the left on like a slow walk instead of super fast, right? Whenever we get our people in power. And that is because they have mostly leftist views on most things, except for war in the Middle East and war with Russia. Now, that doesn't mean that's the only thing going on. That doesn't mean that other people who are not this group of people have their own agendas and like they're playing out their things, and that the Middle East isn't doing also things that's upsetting other agendas and other people. Okay, this is just one group, and it's not the only group, and it's not the only worldview. But I'm just explaining what that was, and we're seeing it again today, but in a really weird, disturbing way. And I'm going to make a video about it because I made that video, my last one. Well, it probably won't be my last one when I put this out, but my Let's Talk About Joe Kent, Nick Fuentes, and Tucker video. So I did some more research and I have found out a lot of really weird stuff. So it's almost like the same thing happening today. People on the left getting freaked out by how far left the left is going. And then they're becoming on the right, but they're really not staunchly right thinking or conservative leaning. They still have very much leftist tendencies. And so then they're clashing with the establishment right. It's the same thing we've seen in back in the day in history. So that's why I always say it's really important to know history, because then you can understand more about what's going on right now, because it's almost the same exact playbook. So anyway, that is it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this reading. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and comment below and let me know you're reading along with me. So it gives me encouragement to keep recording these horrible recordings where I'm basically can't pronounce anything in this book. Um, but thank you guys for being here, and that's the end of that video, and I'll see you next time on The Eclectic Journalist.